Sila's creed had seen fear before. He had seen it in men bleeding out on hard ground and in children hiding behind wagons when bad news rode into camp. What he had not seen was a woman holding a baby like the last living thing in the world, looking down at him from a roof as if she had already gone past fear and come out somewhere colder. Her face was hollow. Her lips were cracked. The child at her breast was too quiet. When Sila stepped closer, she did not flinch. She only looked at him with those dry, steady eyes and said, "You're late." Then she shifted the baby higher against her chest, as if she had been saving her strength for that one sentence alone. He should have answered right then. He should have told her he was not the man she had been waiting for. Instead, he stood there with dust on his boots and a fist tightening around the reins, feeling as if he had ridden into the middle of someone else's promise and found only the bones of it left behind. The baby gave a thin cry, no louder than a kitten. The woman lowered her face to the child's hair and closed her eyes for one breath. When she looked at Sila's again, there was no welcome in her, but no fear either. Just a question she was too tired to ask. And all at once he knew this was no passing kindness. If he turned away now, he would hear that child's cry the rest of his life. The place around her looked half dead. The cabin below the roof had one black wall caved inward, and the old chicken shed behind it was nothing but ash and crooked nails. A scorched wagon wheel leaned near the well like a broken rib. Smoke still lived in the dirt, old and bitter. Sila's had been bound for Alder Crossing with trapped skins and supplies strapped behind his saddle, but a dark mark on the horizon had pulled him off the trail. Now he knew why. He took another step and tipped back his hat so she could see his face clear. "Can you climb down if I take the baby?" he asked. She looked at him a long time before she nodded once. Then, moving like each bone in her body hurt, she crawled to the edge of the roof and lowered the child toward him. He took the baby with both hands. The little boy weighed almost nothing. That frightened him more than the ruin of the homestead. A red patch marked one cheek and pale lashes lay against skin too thin for a child that age. The woman came down after him, inch by inch, gripping the porch post, one foot searching for the rail below. When her boots touched the ground, her knees buckled. Sila's caught her elbow before she fell. She jerked at first, not from fear, but from pride still hanging on by a thread. "Easy," he said. "I've got you." She pulled free as soon as she could stand on her own. "What is his name?" Sila's asked, rocking the baby without thinking. "Jonah," she said. Her voice was worn raw. "My name is Willa Hart," he nodded. Sila's creed, then he glanced at the burned field, the empty yard, the dead place all around them. "And the man who left you here?" Her jaw tightened, but she answered, "Darren Pike. He rode out in April, said he would find work in Silver Ridge and send for us." She did not cry when she said it. That was the hard part. A crying woman he could comfort. A woman who had gone still inside was something else. "And he never came back," Sila said. She lifted her chin as if he had insulted her. "He said he would." The baby stirred in his arms and gave a weak fuss. Willa reached out at once, and Sila's handed Jonah back to her. She tucked the child against her and swayed a little where she stood. "How long since you ate?" he asked. She did not answer. He took that for the truth. The answer must have been bad enough to shame her. "I've got a cabin east of here by Willow Draw," he said. "Food, water, a clean bed. You and the boy are coming with me." She shook her head so fast he saw panic flicker at last. "No, he might come back and not find us." Sila's looked at the roof, then at the charred boards under their feet. He chose his words slow. "Ma'am, if a man leaves a woman and his baby in a place like this, then he already made his choice." Her face changed then, not because she believed him, because she had feared it all along. She turned her head away and pressed her lips to Jonah's hair. Wind moved her faded dress against her legs. She looked so tired Sila's thought she might blow apart like dust. "Just for one night," he said, softer now. "You can leave in the morning if that's what you want." She stood silent long enough that he heard a board crack somewhere in the ruins behind them. At last she nodded. "One night," she said. He lifted her onto the horse first, then passed Jonah up into her arms. She held the baby close and sat stiff in the saddle like someone who had forgotten how to trust the ground. Sila's walked beside the horse all the way home. He could have ridden. He did not. He kept one hand near the reins and the other close enough to steady her if she slipped. They reached his place near dusk. His cabin was small and plain, weather gray with a split-rail fence and a lean-to on one side for the milk goat. 3 hens scratched under the sage by the step. Willa stared at it as if it were a church. Silas opened the door and motioned her in first. Inside, the room smelled of cedar smoke and old pine. He set water to heat and pulled a clean blanket from the chest at the foot of his bed. "You take the bed," he said. "I'll sleep by the stove." She looked at him, suspicious from habit more than reason. "Why?" He shrugged once. "Because you need it more." He made stew from beans, onion, and the last of a venison roast. Willa ate slowly at first, then faster when her body remembered hunger. She tried to stop after a few bites, maybe ashamed of how much she wanted it, but Silas set more in her bowl without a word. Jonah woke and cried while she ate, and Silas took him up awkwardly, bouncing him against his shoulder until the child settled. He had helped raise his brother's girls after the war took the man and nearly took the farm with him. A baby did not scare him. Willa watched every move he made with the child. Not doubtful, just careful. When she finished, she whispered, "Thank you," like the words scraped on the way out. Silas sat across from her in the firelight and said, "You don't owe me anything for a meal," but something in her eyes said she had spent too much of her life paying for every kindness twice. That night the cabin stayed quiet except for the stove ticking and Jonah's sleepy breaths. Willa lay on the bed with the baby curled into her side, one hand still resting over his back even in sleep. Silas stretched out on a folded blanket near the fire and stared up at the beams. He told himself this was only for a night. By morning she would take the child and go on waiting somewhere else, or head for town, or vanish down some road that had already taken enough from her. Yet his mind kept circling back to the look on her face when she had said those words on the roof. "You're late," not angry, not accusing, just certain. As if she had held on until the very last minute and he had arrived in the place where hope had almost died. He did not know what troubled him more, that she had been waiting for the wrong man, or that a part of him had felt those words land like they belonged to him. He woke before dawn to the sound of soft movement outside. His hand went to the rifle by the door before his eyes were fully open. Then he saw Willa through the window, barefoot in the grass, standing by the garden patch with Jonah tied against her chest in a strip of cloth. She was only looking, not stealing, not running. Looking at the bean poles, the onion rows, the little square of green he had kept alive through dry months by hauling water bucket by bucket. When he stepped onto the porch, she turned. Morning light caught the hollows in her cheeks, but it also showed something else. Color, faint as a promise, had come back to her face. "I didn't mean to wake you," she said. "You did." Silas came down the step and stopped beside her. "There's always work here if you need your hands busy." She glanced at the garden, then toward the cabin behind them. "I can work," he believed her. He also saw what sat under the words. She was not asking for chores. She was asking if she could stay one day longer without being a burden. Silas looked at Jonah sleeping warm against her breast, then met her eyes. "Good," he said. "Because I've been waiting on help I didn't know had my name on it." For the first time the corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was smaller and more fragile than that. But it was the first sign that the woman on the roof might still be somewhere inside her. And as Silas stood there in the pale light, watching her hold his gaze instead of the horizon, one thought settled in his chest and stayed. The late man had lost her. Silas only had to prove he meant to stay. Silas had expected Willa to leave by noon. Maybe by supper if the meal and sleep gave her enough strength to return to whatever thin piece of hope she still carried. Instead she stayed through the day without speaking much, moving careful around the cabin as if she feared touching the wrong thing and being turned back out. She washed the bowls before he could reach for them. She swept the floor with an old broom missing half its straw. When Jonah woke crying, she walked him in slow circles by the window until he went quiet again. Silas mended tack on the porch and listened to the sounds inside. A chair scraping, water poured into a pan, the low hum of her voice to the baby. By evening the cabin felt changed in a way he could not name. It was still his table, his stove, his worn coat hanging by the door. But something in the room had softened. It no longer sounded like one man passing time alone. It sounded like people living. At supper she ate with more ease than the night before. Not fast now, steady. Jonah sat in her lap and worked his gums on a spoon while Silas broke cornbread into his bowl. "How old is he?" Silas asked. Willa brushed a thumb over the baby's cheek. "Near 7 months, I think." The words sat there between them. Silas looked up. "You think?" She held his gaze a moment, then looked down. "I lost count toward the end. Days all ran together after the fire." He nodded once. That told him enough. She had not been living by days anymore. She had been living by waiting. After a while he said, "There's room in the loft for dry goods. I aim to fix a second shelf tomorrow. If you mean to stay another day, I can use another pair of hands." Willa glanced at him quick, searching his face for some hidden price. She found none. "All right," she said. Then after a pause she added, "Another day." The next morning she was already up when he came in from feeding the goat. She had tied back her hair with a strip torn from the hem of an old apron he kept for kindling rags. The cabin smelled of coffee and hot oats. Silas stopped just inside the door and stared like a fool until she noticed. "I found the beans in the blue tin," she said. "I hoped you wouldn't mind." He set down the milk pail. "Mind," he said. "Woman, I may never forgive you if you stop." That brought a real smile, small but honest. It changed her face. She looked younger with it, and sadder too, because it showed how long it had likely been since she had won. He ate at the table while she stood at the stove with Jonah tied to her chest. The child had more color already. His eyes followed the morning light across the floorboards, and once he let out a little sound that was not quite a laugh but near enough. Silas heard it and felt something answer inside him before he could stop it. Days took on a shape after that. Silas handled the fence line, the stock, and a patch of ground near the creek where he meant to cut hay later in the season. Willa washed clothes in the yard, worked the garden, and patched every shirt he owned as if torn cloth offended her on a personal level. Jonah began to know the cabin sounds: the creak of the door, the scrape of Silas's chair, the clink of the kettle lid. When Silas stepped in after noon work, the baby would turn his head toward the sound and kick until Willa laughed and said, "Looks like he's claimed you." Silas pretended not to hear the warmth in her voice. He would hold out his hands anyway, and Jonah would come with less fuss each time. It should have felt strange, taking another man's child into his arms like that. It did not. The strangeness was how natural it felt. One hot afternoon Willa found him at the woodpile, splitting kindling down for winter stacks. Sweat ran dark along his shirt and stung his eyes. She stood there with a tin cup in each hand, Jonah asleep against her shoulder. "Water," she said. He took the cup and drank half in one pull. "You keep this up, I'll think you're trying to make yourself useful." She did not step back at his teasing. "I am useful," she said. "You're only now noticing." He gave a low laugh. "That's so." She knelt by the smaller pile and began stacking the pieces he split. For a while they worked without speech. Axe, thud, wood set in neat rows, a cicada whining in the cottonwoods. At last she said, "How long have you been here?" Silas rested the axe head on the ground. 8 years come fall." She looked toward the cabin. "All alone?" He shrugged. "Mostly. My brother's daughters stayed one winter after he died. Then their aunt took them east when she remarried. Been just me since." Willa set a stick in place and brushed dirt from her palms. "That's a long quiet." He looked at her. "Sometimes quiet suits a man. Sometimes it starts sounding like something missing." That evening she told him more than she had before. Not all at once. Willa never talked that way. Her truth came in pieces, like cloth laid one square at a time until the shape could be seen. She had been born near the Missouri north of Yankton. Her mother died when she was 14. Her father took to drink, then took a second wife who wanted no part of a half-grown girl underfoot. Willa left at 16 with 2 dresses and a pair of shoes already worn thin. She worked kitchens, washed sheets in boarding houses, sewed hems for storekeepers' wives. She met Darren in a town dance hall where the music had been better than the company. He had a way of speaking that made plain things sound certain, she said. Silas sat across from her by the stove, saying nothing. He talked like a man who knew where life was headed. I mistook that for steadiness. She gave a humorless smile and smoothed Jonah's blanket. That was my mistake, not his. Silas's hand tightened around the tin cup he held. No, he said. Leaving you and the boy to starve was his. She looked up then, surprised by the iron in his voice. For a moment neither spoke. Firelight moved over the walls. Jonah sighed in sleep. Willa's eyes rested on Silas as if she were measuring him against something old and bitter. You never ask the questions other folks ask, she said. Maybe I don't care for other folks' business. She shook her head faintly. No, it's more than that. You don't look at me like I've spoiled. The words settled heavy. Silas leaned forward, forearms on his knees. Listen to me, Willa. A man's cowardice does not stain a woman, and a child born of bad promises is still a child worth the whole world. Her mouth parted, then closed again. She lowered her head fast, but not before he saw tears gather. She did not let them fall. Instead, she pressed her lips to Jonah's soft hair and breathed through whatever had risen in her chest. Silas wanted to cross the room. He stayed where he was. Some hurts need space more than hands. The first time they went to town together, it happened because flour had run low and the mule needed new trace leather. Willa said she would stay behind. Silas said no. You need cloth for the boy and thread for that mending you've turned into a full trade. She hesitated at the doorway with Jonah on her hip. Folks will ask questions. Silas buckled the harness strap. Let them ask. They'll get tired before I do. So she climbed into the wagon seat beside him and kept her face turned to the road for the first mile. By the time they rolled into Dry Creek, the place had begun to wake under the noon heat. Men stood outside the feed store. Women moved in and out of the mercantile with baskets on their arms. Willa's spine went straight as a fence post. Silas saw it and stepped down first, then held out his hand for Jonah before offering the same hand to her. She took it after only a beat. Inside the mercantile, the widow Penrose looked Willa over once and then looked at Jonah. Silas braced for the turn such looks often took. But the widow only said, "That child needs a sun hat, and you need better shoes." Willa blinked, caught off guard. Silas hid a smile by reaching for a sack of flour. While Willa felt cloth between her fingers at the back table, Jonah sat on Silas's hip chewing a leather strap from the harness store. Two old men by the barrel stove muttered something about Silas taking on a ready-made family. Silas turned his head just enough for them to see his face. They went quiet. When he looked back, Willa was watching him. There was wonder in her expression, and something gentler than wonder. On the ride home, she kept one hand resting against the wagon seat between them, not touching him, near enough that he could feel the choice in it. That night wind gathered hard against the cabin, carrying the smell of coming rain. After Jonah slept, Willa stepped onto the porch and wrapped her shawl around herself. Silas followed a minute later and leaned on the post beside her. The sky flashed pale beyond the far ridge. "I used to think a home was something a man gave you if he chose you," she said quietly. "Now I'm not so sure." Silas looked out over the dark yard. "What do you think now?" She took her time answering. "I think maybe it's the place where no one keeps one foot pointed toward the door." He turned then. She was looking at him, not the land, not the road, not the black distance where promises died. Him. Wind lifted loose strands of hair across her cheek. Silas reached out before he could think better of it and tucked them back. His fingers brushed warm skin. She did not move away. Her breath caught, so did his. For one long second the whole world seemed to wait with them. Then Jonah stirred inside with a sleepy cry and the spell broke. Willa stepped back, hand pressed to her shawl. Silas let his arm fall. Neither spoke, but when she turned to go in, she looked over her shoulder once, and what he saw in her eyes told him this had already gone past kindness. It was only a matter of who found the courage to name it first. Silas did not sleep much after that night on the porch. It was not regret that kept him awake. It was caution. He knew how fast a lonely man could mistake gratitude for love and how easy it was to ruin something gentle by reaching for it before it was ready. So the next morning he rose before dawn, dressed in the dark, and went out to mend the lower fence along the creek before the sun had fully broken. He worked longer than he needed to, hammering nails that were already firm, squaring posts that did not need squaring. By the time he came back, the sky was bright and the cabin door stood open. Willa was kneeling by the wash basin with Jonah sitting on a blanket near her feet, slapping at a wooden spoon and laughing at his own noise. She looked up when Silas stepped into the yard. For one small, awkward breath, both of them remembered his hand at her cheek. Then she lowered her eyes and reached for the wet shirt in the basin as if the cloth demanded all her care. Silas carried in a fresh armload of wood and set it by the stove. "Fence is holding," he said, though she had not asked. Willa nodded. "That's good." She did not look at him. He stood there another second, feeling more foolish than he had in years. Then Jonah squealed and kicked both heels against the blanket. The sound cut the tension clean through. Willa smiled despite herself and gathered the baby into her arms. "He's discovered he has a voice," she said. Silas took off his hat and hung it on the peg. "Hope he plans to use it for something wiser than most men do." That earned him a faint laugh. It helped. Not enough to erase the memory of the porch, but enough to let the morning breathe again. By noon the two of them had found their footing, speaking of flour, goat feed, and the patch of squash he meant to clear beside the garden. Even so, under every plain word, something new kept moving. It was there in the pauses, in the way her gaze sometimes lifted to his and held a moment too long. The next change came from Jonah. The boy had begun to crawl with purpose, dragging himself across the floorboards after any object that caught his eye. A spoon, a bootlace, the corner of Silas's coat where it hung by the door. One afternoon Silas sat at the table cutting harness straps when Jonah made his determined way all the way from Willa's skirts to his boots. He looked down just as the baby hauled himself upright against his shin and patted the leather with one unsteady hand. "Well now," Silas said, "you've got opinions already." Willa, kneading biscuit dough at the counter, turned and laughed. "He likes anything that looks worn enough to chew." Silas set the strap aside and bent down, lifting the boy under his arms. Jonah gave a delighted sound and grabbed Silas's beard stubble at once. Silas winced. Willa covered her mouth, laughing harder now, the kind of laugh that came from deep in the chest and surprised even her. Silas looked up at her, still half bent over the baby, and the sight of her standing there in the afternoon light, flour on her hands and joy softening her whole face, hit him harder than any blow. That evening, while Jonah slept in a crate lined with quilts near the fire, Willa sat by the lamp with one of Silas's shirts across her lap. The elbow had split clean through, and she was mending it with small, neat stitches. Silas sharpened a blade near the door, though he had already sharpened it the day before. "You don't have to keep fixing my things," he said. She did not look up. "You don't have to keep pretending you don't notice I've already done it." He smiled despite himself. "That plain enough for you?" She tied off the thread and smoothed the cloth. "Plain is usually best." Silence settled, but it was not empty. At last she asked, "Why didn't you ever marry?" The scrape of whetstone slowed under his hand. He could have given the easy answer, never found the right one. Life got busy. Time got away. Instead he told her the truth. "After the war I spent a long while thinking if I kept folks at arm's length, I'd lose less when they left." She looked at him then. "Did it work?" He shook his head once. "No, it just made the empty parts quieter." She lowered her sewing. "I used to think if I was agreeable enough, useful enough, patient enough, people would stay." Silas leaned back in his chair. "And did that work?" Willa gave a tired little smile. "No, it just made me easier to leave." The honesty of it landed between them like something set down with care. Neither rushed to cover it. Wind moved along the roof. The lamp hissed softly. Jonah slept on, one fist open near his face. Silas looked at her across that small room and understood something he had not named before. Willa was not weak because she had waited. She had been starved of steadiness so long that the first promise spoken kindly had sounded like shelter. That was not foolishness. That was hunger of a different kind. "You weren't wrong to want someone to stay," he said quietly. "You were wrong only in the man you chose to trust." Her eyes shone in the lamplight. She nodded once, then bent her head over the shirt again, because there are some mercies a person can take only if their hands are busy. Late that week, a storm rolled down from the hills without much warning. By mid-afternoon the sky had gone the color of old iron, and wind drove dust through the yard in sharp spinning lines. Silas had just gotten the hens shut under the linta when the first drop struck his cheek. Then came another. Then a sheet of hard rain. He ran for the cabin and reached the porch just as thunder cracked over the valley. Inside, he found Willa near the hearth with Jonah in her arms, both of them turned toward the window. Every flash of lightning lit the room stark and white. Jonah startled at the next thunder roll and began to cry. Willa rocked him, but the baby only cried harder, little body stiff with fear. Silas stepped over, hesitated, then held out his hands. "Let me try," she passed Jonah to him. Silas settled into the chair by the fire and laid the boy against his chest, one broad palm over the baby's back. "There now," he murmured. "Storm's got a loud mouth." That's all Jonah hiccuped through a sob. Silas kept talking low and even nonsense more than sense, about creeks swelling, about hens with more pride than brains, about a mule he once owned that had hated rain worse than any Christian ever hated sin. Willa stood watching, one hand curled against her collarbone. Little by little Jonah quieted. When the child had gone limp with sleep, Silas looked up and found Willa still staring at him. The storm beat against the roof so hard it sounded like handfuls of pebbles thrown from the sky. "What?" he asked. Her throat moved. Nothing, he knew better. That wasn't a nothing look. She came closer and rested one hand on the chair back. "I was just thinking I've never seen a man soothe a child without acting like he was doing someone a favor." He glanced down at Jonah. "He's easy company." Willa shook her head. "No. You are." That sat between them for a moment, warmer than the fire. Then she moved to sit on the stool opposite him, close enough that their knees almost touched. Outside, the storm went on raging. Inside, the room had shrunk to the circle of lamplight, the sleeping child, and the two adults who had stopped pretending they were untouched by each other. When the rain finally eased toward evening, the roof gave a slow drip at one corner near the bed. Silas dragged over a bucket and climbed onto the chair to inspect the leak. "Loose shingle," he said. "I can fix it in the morning." Willa was below him, steadying the chair with both hands without being asked. "You always know what needs mending," she said. He looked down at her. "Only with wood and nails." "Rest of life I mostly guess." She kept her hands on the chair. "You guess better than most." He should have climbed down then. Instead, he stayed there a beat longer, looking at her turned-up face, the damp curl at her temple from the heat of the room, the trust that had begun to live in her eyes. His chest tightened. He stepped down carefully. Neither moved away. Willa's hands remained on the chair back, inches from his waist. Silas could smell rain on her skin and soap from the wash basin. He raised one hand, giving her enough time to stop him. She did not. His fingers brushed her cheek again, slower this time. She leaned into the touch before she seemed to realize she had done it. The kiss should not have happened then. It was too soon. The floor was wet by the bed. The bucket dripped. Jonah slept near the hearth with one sock missing. Yet it happened because neither of them could stand another day of speaking around the truth. Silas bent his head and kissed her softly, not with hunger first, with care. Willa made a small sound against his mouth that almost undid him. Her hands caught in his shirt as if she needed to hold onto something solid. For one deep breath she kissed him back. Then she pulled away, not in fear, in sorrow. Silas stepped back at once. "I'm sorry," he said, voice rough. "No." She pressed her fingers to her lips. "Don't say that." She turned from him and walked 2 paces toward the window before stopping. Rain tapped at the sill. "I wanted it," she whispered. "That's the trouble." Silas waited. She wrapped both arms around herself. "I don't know how to do this right. I don't know how to trust what feels kind when kindness used to be the start of being fooled." Silas let the silence sit until it felt safe enough for truth. "Then don't trust fast," he said. "Don't give me anything on account of gratitude or loneliness or because this roof is warmer than the last one. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." She turned then, and tears finally stood in her eyes. Real tears this time, not hidden. "You say that easy," she said. "No," he answered. "I say it careful." That seemed to strike somewhere deep. She wiped at one cheek with the heel of her hand and gave a shaky nod. Then she crossed the room to Jonah and lifted him gently from the quilt. When she passed Silas, She paused just long enough to brush her fingers once against the back of his hand. It was not much. It was more than enough. That night she slept in his bed with the baby against her side, and Silas lay by the stove listening to the rain slow on the roof, knowing he had crossed into dangerous country at last. Not because he had kissed her, because he meant every word he had said. Morning came washed clean after the storm. The yard smelled of wet earth and split cedar. Water dripped from the eaves in a slow, steady rhythm, and the creek beyond the cottonwoods ran louder than it had the day before. Silas had already gone outside by the time Will awoke. She lay still for a moment with Jonah warm against her side and listened to the quiet he left behind. Not empty quiet. Working quiet. The kind that came from a man already hauling, fixing, checking, making sure the day would hold. She stared at the ceiling and touched her lips once, remembering the kiss, then dropped her hand as if caught. A part of her wanted to step backward into the safer shape their days had held before. Another part of her knew there was no going backward now. Something true had been said, and once truth entered a room, it did not leave because people felt shy in the morning. She dressed, fed Jonah, and stepped outside with a basin on one hip. Silas was on the roof over the back lean-to, replacing the loose shingle the storm had rattled free. He glanced down when he heard the door. For one heartbeat they simply looked at each other. Then he nodded toward the well. Bored by the troughs loose too. I'll get to it after this. His voice was steady, plain. He was giving her the gift of not forcing meaning into the morning. Willa felt some knot inside her loosen. I can hold the ladder when you come down, she said. It's wedged firm, I know, she answered. I'll hold it anyway. That brought the smallest pull at the corner of his mouth. She stood there while he finished with the shingles, one hand on the ladder rail, Jonah shifting on her hip and reaching up at the moving shadows above. When Silas climbed down, he did not touch her, but his shoulder brushed hers in passing. It was enough to send a quiet warmth through her that stayed long after he moved away. The day settled into work the way days always did. Willa scrubbed clothes at the wash line. Silas repaired the trough. Jonah spent half the morning on a quilt in the shade, kicking his legs and crowing at the chickens like he meant to command them. By afternoon the sun had steamed the mud into a rich, dark smell, and the garden looked greener than it had a week before. Willa knelt among the bean rows, pulling weeds while Jonah gnawed on a smooth wooden ring beside her. Silas came over carrying a bundle of cut willow switches for staking the peas. He planted one, then another, then paused. Town on Saturday, he said. She kept her eyes on the weeds. For supplies. That and Mrs. Penrose sent word through Chet Wilburn. Wants to know if the woman with the neat stitches is taking mending. Willa looked up fast. She said that. Silas nodded. Said half the town wears its sleeves thin and most of the women sew with more hope than skill. Willa laughed under her breath. Then the laughter faded into something careful. Do you think she means it? Silas drove the last switch into the dirt. I think a woman like her doesn't waste time saying what she doesn't mean. That small news carried through the rest of the day like sunlight under a door. Willa found herself standing straighter, moving with more life in her steps. After supper, she took out the little bundle of scraps and thread she had collected from Silas's chest and set to work by lamplight, turning torn cuffs right side out and stitching a hem on one of his older shirts. Silas sat at the table oiling the harness, watching her over the bottle neck when she was not looking. Jonah slept in the crate by the fire, one hand flung above his head like a man too content to bother with caution. You'll wear a hole in that leather if you keep rubbing the same strap, Willa said without glancing up. Silas looked down and realized she was right. Wasn't aware I was under inspection. She threaded the needle again. You live in a one-room cabin, everything's under inspection. He let out a quiet laugh. Then the room softened. The lamp glowed. The fire settled. Willa kept sewing and he kept watching the line of her bent head, the calm of her hands. At length he said, about yesterday. Her fingers paused on the cloth, then continued. You told me I could take my time. I heard you. He nodded once. All right, that was enough for now. Saturday came warm and bright. Willa wore the blue dress she had washed twice since arriving, and Silas had brought her a length of faded ribbon from the mercantile weeks earlier without making much of it. She tied it into her hair before stepping into the wagon. The ribbon was nothing fine. Even so, Silas noticed it at once and had to look away before the noticing showed too plainly on his face. Jonah sat between them at first, patting the seat board with both palms until the motion of the wagon lulled him sleepy. Willa shifted the child into her lap and watched the road ahead. "I'm not afraid of town," she said after a while, "but I am afraid of the way people decide what a woman is after looking at her for 10 seconds. Silas kept the reins loose over the mule's back. "Then let them try it with you sitting next to me." She looked at him. "That's not a full shield, no," he said, "but it's the one I've got." Dry Creek was busier than before. A freight wagon had come in from the north, and men were unloading sacks in front of the general store. Mrs. Penrose stood near the mercantile porch in a dark dress despite the heat, her gray hair pinned back so tight it looked like it had never once entertained nonsense. She spotted Willa at once and walked straight over. "You came," she said, not warm exactly, but not cold either. Her eyes slid to Jonah. "And the child's looking better fed." Willa held the baby a little closer, unsure how to answer. Mrs. Penrose spared her the trouble. "I have a basket in back with 2 aprons, 1 man's shirt and a little girl's Sunday hem that needs letting down. If you mend them neat, I'll tell people so. If you don't, I'll tell them that too." Willa blinked, then gave the smallest nod. "I can do them neat," Mrs. Penrose sniffed. "Good. I dislike sloppy work more than I dislike gossip, and that's saying something." Silas left Willa with the widow while he handled his business at the feed store and smithy. When he returned, he found Willa by the cloth table with Jonah on one hip and a basket of mending on the floor at her feet. There was color in her cheeks, real color, not from heat, from being spoken to as if she were useful, capable, worth hiring. Mrs. Penrose stood nearby pretending not to hover. "You done?" Willa asked Silas. He nodded. "Near enough," the widow cut in before either could say more. "Bring the work back by Thursday if your hands are as good as your face says they are." Willa almost smiled. "My face doesn't say much, no," Mrs. Penrose replied. "That's why I'm curious about the hands on the ride home." Willa kept touching the basket as if making sure it remained real. Jonah fell asleep with one fist wrapped in the handle. "It's not much," she said. "It's the beginning of much," Silas answered. She turned to him then, and the look she gave him held something deeper than gratitude. It held relief, as if a locked door inside her had opened 1 inch and let air in. But not all town business came home easy. Near the edge of Dry Creek, as Silas was loading a sack of grain into the wagon, a voice called his name from behind. He turned and saw a broad man in a sweat-stained hat stepping off the porch of the saloon. Harlan Pike, Darren's older brother. Silas knew him by sight and by the kind of reputation that clung to a family even when one met only half of it. Harlan's eyes slid from Silas to Willa in the wagon. Recognition flared at once. "Well now," he said. "Ain't that a turn?" Willa went white so fast Silas saw it from 10 feet away. She pulled Jonah tight against her chest. Harlan sauntered closer with the lazy confidence of a man who thought his size counted as authority. "Darren said he found himself a soft little thing east of Fort Shaw last year," he drawled. "Didn't mention she'd end up parked at your place." Silas stepped between him and the wagon. "That's close enough." Harlan gave a short laugh. "No offense meant. I'm only saying if my brother's got a claim, he'll likely come to collect it sooner or later." Willa made a sound then, not loud but sharp enough to cut. "He forfeited any claim when he left his son to starve." Harlan looked past Silas, amused now. "Son, is it? You sound sure." Silas saw the blow land before Willa's face changed. The insult was plain, not just aimed at her, at Jonah too. He took 1 step closer until Harlan's grin thinned. "You can say what you like about me," Silas said quietly. "Say another word about that woman or child and you'll pick your teeth out of the dirt." Men nearby had gone still. Harlan weighed the room, the witnesses, the fact that Silas was not bluffing, and decided his appetite for trouble ran smaller than his mouth. He spat to one side and backed off. All right, keep what ain't yours. See if my brother thanks you for it." Then he turned and strode back toward the saloon. Silas loaded the grain without another word and climbed into the wagon. Willa's hands were shaking so hard Jonah had begun to fuss from the movement. They rode half a mile before he spoke. "He won't come near you again in town." Willa stared ahead, jaw tight. "It was Harlan that frightened me." Silas waited. She swallowed. It was hearing Darren spoken aloud like he might still step out from somewhere and twist everything into a mess again. Jonah whimpered. She kissed his hair. "I hate that he still has that kind of reach in me." Silas kept his voice low. "Fear isn't loyalty." She turned toward him slowly. No, it's memory. That's all." Willa held his gaze, and some of the wildness in her face settled. By the time they reached home, the basket of mending seemed less like a gift from town and more like something earned in a world that had tried to shame her and failed. That night she finished one apron, turned the shirt cuffs, and set the child's hem with stitches so small they nearly vanished into the cloth. Silas split kindling on the porch until dark, giving her room after the strain of town. When he came in, she was still at the table. Jonah slept across the bed with one chubby foot bare. Willa set the needle down and looked at Silas across the lamp glow. "When Harlan spoke that way," she said, "I thought for one second you might turn and ask me if he was right to question the child." Silas went still. "And if I had?" Her face tightened, but she answered. "Then I would have taken Jonah and left before sunrise. I couldn't survive that." Twice the words hung there, raw and honest. Silas crossed the room slow, stopping beside her chair. "Look at me," he said. She did. "I don't care whose blood runs in that boy. I care who holds him when he cries. Who feeds him, who stays. That's what makes kin." Willa's lower lip trembled once before she pressed it still. Then very carefully she laid her hand over his. "I needed to hear you say it." He turned his hand and threaded their fingers together. "Then hear this too," he said. "No one from that man's life gets to walk into ours and speak over what you've built here. Hers. Ours." The words entered the room and stayed. The days after Dry Creek changed something between them, not in a loud way. No grand promises were made. No one stood in the yard and declared a future. But the cabin no longer felt like a place Willa was borrowing. It felt like ground she had begun to stand on with both feet. She finished the basket from Mrs. Penrose in 3 days, every hem clean, every cuff turned true, every patch laid flat enough to pass a close eye. Silas rode the work back into town and returned with 2 more shirts, a tablecloth with a torn edge, and a small sack of sugar tied shut with string. When Willa saw the sugar, she frowned. "That wasn't needed." Silas set it on the shelf. "No, it was wanted." She folded her arms. "By who?" He glanced at Jonah on the floor, trying to fit a spoon into the neck of a bottle and failing with great determination. "By the man who's grown fond of seeing you smile over something that doesn't come from surviving." Willa looked away too fast for indifference. But he saw the color rise in her cheeks, and later that night he caught her measuring out a little spoonful into the cornbread, as if sweetness itself might be too fine a thing to waste. By early September the air had sharpened at dawn. The grass silvered before sunrise, and the hills beyond the creek stood pale and still in the first light. Silas began cutting boards from the small stack of pine he had kept dry behind the lean-to. He worked on them in the evenings after chores, fitting and planing, measuring twice, then standing back as if checking a thought before speaking it aloud. Willa watched for 2 days without asking. On the 3rd she found him behind the cabin setting the frame against the rear wall. Jonah sat in a basket nearby chewing on a cloth corner and watching the hammer rise and fall. "You're building something," Willa said. Silas kept his eyes on the nail head. "Seems I am." She came closer. "What for?" He drove the nail home, then looked at her. "A room, small one, for the boy when he grows enough to need space of his own." Willa stared at the frame, then at him again. "You didn't ask if we'd still be here by then." He wiped the back of his wrist across his brow. "No, why not?" His answer came plain. "Because I was tired of building my life around the chance folks might leave." She stood very still after that. A breeze moved through the dry weeds by the fence. Jonah slapped the side of the basket and laughed at the sound he made. Willa looked at the little frame again, at the careful cuts, the boards already chosen and stacked, the work of a man who had spent his labor on a future without asking for guarantees first. When she spoke, her voice had gone soft. That scares me more than if you'd asked. Silas nodded once. I know, and you did it anyway. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment as if trying to decide whether she was offended, comforted, or simply seen too clearly. At last she said, "Then the least I can do is help raise the walls straight." He handed her the square without a word. They worked side by side the rest of the afternoon. He held the boards. She checked the line. Jonah dozed in the shade, then woke and crowed at the hammer blows as though he approved of everyone. By sunset the frame stood in place, and when Willa stepped back to look at it, there were tears in her eyes she did not hide. That night after Jonah slept, she took the tin box from the bottom of her bundle and set it on the table between them. Silas had seen her guard that box since the first day. She had kept it close through washings, town trips, and even sleep. Now she opened it carefully and tipped the contents into her palm. 2 silver rings, worn thin, dull with age, one smaller than the other. "My mother's," she said. She wore them stacked together before her hands swelled from work and whether. Silas looked at the rings and then at her face. "You've carried them all this time," Willa nodded. "Sewn into a hem at first, then hidden in the lining of my bag. I used to tell myself I was keeping them because they were mine by blood. Truth is, I kept them because I wanted proof that once, before everything turned mean, there had been a woman in my family who was loved in daylight." Silas reached out and took one ring into his palm. It was warm from her skin. "And now?" he asked. Willa looked down at her hands. "Now I want them to mean something living again." He did not speak for a while. Firelight moved slow across the table, across her face, across the silver ring in his hand. Jonah slept in the crate by the hearth, one arm flung up as if dreaming big things already. "Willa," Silas said at last, and his voice had changed. Not rough. Steady in the way a door sounds when it closes firm. "If I ask you what I'm thinking of asking, I don't want you saying yes because I brought you in from the road. I don't want yes from fear or gratitude or because winter's coming and this roof is easier than starting over." She looked at him then, and her eyes were bright. "And if I say yes because this is the first place that has ever felt like the truth," he held her gaze, "then I'd spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of it." Her breath shook once. She reached across the table and closed his fingers around the ring. "Ask me anyway." Silas rose from his chair and came around the table slowly, as if approaching a frightened thing he had no wish to spook. But Willa was not frightened now. She stood too. There was a quiet strength in her face that had not been there on the roof, nor in the burned yard, nor even in the first weeks at his cabin. Hurt still lived in her. So did caution, but something taller stood beside them now. Choice. He stopped in front of her and took both her hands. "Marry me," he said. No speech. No borrowed poetry. Just the plain thing. Not because you need rescuing. Not because the boy needs a name. Marry me because I have come to love the sound of your steps in this house. Because that child feels right in my arms. Because when I think of next season or the one after it, I think of you there." Willa let out one broken breath that was almost a laugh and almost a sob. "You make it sound so simple." "It isn't simple," he said. "It's just true." She closed her eyes for a moment and he felt her hands tremble inside his. When she opened them again, tears had slipped free and were running unhidden down her cheeks. "I loved a promise once because it sounded bright," she whispered. "I won't do that again, but I know what steady feels like now. I know what it is to wake without dread. I know what it is to hand my son to a man and not feel fear in my bones." Her grip tightened. "Yes, Silas. Yes, I'll marry you." For one heartbeat neither moved. Then he drew her into him and she went without hesitation, face pressed to his chest, both hands fisting in his shirt. He held her as if all the things he had not said for months had finally found a shape. When he kissed her, it was not the uncertain kiss from the storm night. It was slower, certain. A vow before the words were spoken before witnesses. Willa kissed him back with the same certainty, and when they parted, she rested her forehead against his and laughed wetly through tears. "You are late," she murmured, "but not too late." Silas smiled against her hair. "That'll do." They married 10 days later beneath the big cottonwood by the creek, where the ground stayed green a little longer into fall. Mrs. Penrose came in a dark dress with a basket of still-warm biscuits. Chet Wilburn brought 2 jars of preserves and stood awkwardly in his good coat, as if unsure where to put his hands. Old Reverend Pike from a settlement 2 ridges over rode out to speak the words, though he squinted half the service, as if one eye had gone wandering in his old age. Willa wore her blue dress let out at the hem and altered at the sleeves, with a strip of white cloth sewn at the collar from one of Silas's good handkerchiefs. Her hair was braided with the same faded ribbon from town. Silas wore his clean brown shirt, and the look of a man who had found something he had not dared name for years. Jonah sat on Willa's hip through the first part of the vows, then reached for Silas with both hands at the exact moment the Reverend asked who gave the bride. Laughter moved through the gathered few, and even Willa laughed, clear and bright. Silas took the child, and Jonah patted his beard solemnly as if offering approval. When the rings came out, Willa's hands shook, not from doubt, from the weight of what it meant. Silas slid the smaller silver band onto her finger, and she stared at it like she could hardly believe her own hand had finally become the place where that ring came to rest. Then she put the other on him. It fit more tightly than it had likely fit her mother's husband, but it fit enough. The Reverend cleared his throat and pronounced them man and wife, and Silas did not wait for permission beyond that. He kissed her under the cottonwood while leaves moved overhead in the first cool breeze of the season. Jonah made a delighted noise from his arm. Mrs. Penrose sniffed like she disapproved of public displays, though the corner of her mouth had given her away. They ate biscuits and roasted squash and goat cheese at the table Silas had hauled into the yard, and as dusk fell, Willa sat on the porch beside him with Jonah asleep across both their laps and watched the lantern light swing in the trees. She turned her face toward him, calm and full in a way he had never seen before, and he understood that this was not the end of her rescue. It was the end of her waiting. Marriage did not change the shape of the work, but it changed the spirit of the house. The morning still came early. The goats still kicked at the pail when she was in a mood. The hens still scratched under the porch like they owned the place. Silas still rose before first light to check the fence, and Willa still tied on an apron before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. But now the labor of the day felt joined, shared. When he came in with cold hands, there was always coffee already poured. When she bent over the wash with a sore back, he took the heavier bucket without being asked. Jonah had begun pulling himself up against every chair leg and table edge in the cabin, proud as a king each time he managed it. His laugh came easier now. It filled the corners of the room that had once held only one man's breathing and the crackle of a lonely stove. The small room at the back of the cabin took shape through October. Silas laid the floorboards. Willa stitched curtains from feed sacks and hemmed them neat enough to make plain cloth look almost fine. Jonah crawled in and out over the threshold as if inspecting the work. By the time the first real frost whitened the grass each morning, the little room held a narrow bed frame, a peg on the wall for clothes, and a shelf high enough to keep a lamp out of a child's reach. Willa stood in the doorway one afternoon with Jonah on her hip and looked at the space as if it were something larger than wood and nails. "You built him a future before he could ask for one," she said. Silas was bent over the shelf, testing its steadiness. "Seems to me children ought not have to ask for everything." She was quiet at that. Then she crossed the room and rested her hand between his shoulders, a brief touch warm through his shirt. "No," she said softly. "They ought not." By November, word had spread in Dry Creek about Willa's work. Aprons came, men's shirts with torn cuffs, Sunday collars gone gray at the fold, a quilt top from Mrs. Penrose with one whole corner split where a grandchild had caught it on a nail. Willa worked near the fire while Jonah played at her feet with wooden spoons, scraps of cloth, and a small carved horse Silas whittled for him from pine. Coins began collecting in a crock above the shelf. Not many. Enough to matter. One afternoon Silas came in from splitting wood and found Willa staring into that crock with a strange expression. "What is it?" he asked. She touched the rim with one finger. "I've never earned money in a place where I meant to stay and spend it." Silas set down the axe handle he had brought in to rehang. Then we'll spend it foolish on purpose. Buy coffee better than mine, Willa smiled. That would take real wealth. He walked over and kissed the side of her head. We're working on it. Winter came early that year. A wet snow blew in just before Thanksgiving and stayed in the drifts along the fence line even when the noon sun tried to melt it back. The cabin closed in against the weather. Shutters latched. Fire built high. Blankets brought from the chest and aired by the hearth. Jonah learned to toddle 2 steps at a time from table to chair, then sit down hard and blink in offended surprise when his legs gave out. Willa laughed so often now that Silas sometimes paused in the doorway just to hear it before announcing himself. Yet winter brought its own fears too. The road grew mean in weather. The world narrowed. And on the first hard storm night in December, when the wind struck the cabin broadside and set the shutters banging like gunfire, Willa woke from sleep with a cry trapped in her throat. Silas was up at once. He found her sitting bolt upright in bed, Jonah startled awake beside her and beginning to wail. Her face was white in the dark, one hand pressed against her chest like she could hold her heart still by force. "Willa," he said, crossing the room. "It's only the shutter." She looked at him without seeing him for a second. Then the room came back. The stove glow, Jonah crying. Silas kneeling by the bed. She drew one ragged breath, then another. "I dreamed the roof was gone," she whispered. "I dreamed I was back there and I couldn't keep him warm." Silas reached for Jonah first, settling the boy against his shoulder so Willa could breathe. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and gathered her with his free arm until her forehead rested against him. "You're here," he said. "Look at me. You're here. He's here. That place is gone and it cannot take another thing from you." She trembled against him for a long while before the shaking passed. When it did, she kissed Jonah's damp hair and then Silas's jaw, small, desperate kisses, as if naming what was real by touch. After that night she spoke more openly of the months before Silas found her. Not every detail. Not all at once, but enough that the shadows lost some of their power. She told him how the fire had started in the shed when a lantern tipped in the night wind, how she had beaten it back with wet sacks until her arms gave out, how Darren had been gone nearly 6 weeks by then, how the neighbors nearest had moved off after sickness the winter before, leaving miles of silence in every direction. She admitted that the reason she had climbed onto the roof those last days was not only to see farther down the trail. It was to keep the baby away from the smell of the charred floor and the rats that had begun coming after dark. Silas listened without interrupting, rage moving slow and hot through him at the thought of her alone out there with a child in her arms and no help within shouting distance. When she finished, she looked ashamed of having said so much. He took her face in both hands and said, "Nothing you survived is shameful. The shame belongs to the man who left you there." January laid the valley flat under ice. The creek skinned over at the edges and the mule blew steam in the morning so thick it looked like smoke from a chimney. One afternoon, while Willa was sorting cloth by the fire, she went suddenly still. Silas noticed at once. "What is it?" he asked. She looked up from her chair, one hand low over her middle. There was no fear in her face, only wonder and some disbelief. "I'm late," she said. For one foolish instant he nearly laughed because of the old words between them. Then he understood. He set down the trap line he had been mending and crossed the room in 2 strides. "You're sure?" Willa nodded slowly. "I know my own body now." Jonah, oblivious, sat on the floor banging a spoon against the leg of the table. Silas crouched in front of her chair, hands gripping the wooden arms because he seemed not to know where else to put them. "Willa," he said, and then no more words came. She smiled at him through sudden tears. "That's about how I feel too." He pressed his forehead to her lap and let out a breath that sounded half prayer and half laugh. She was quieter in the weeks after that, not unhappy, only inward in a new way. Sometimes Silas would find her standing by the back room window with one hand resting over her belly, looking out at the snow light on the fence posts. When he asked what she was thinking, she would answer honestly, that "I never thought I'd carry a child without fear sitting beside the joy," or that "it feels strange to hope for something before it arrives." He understood. Hope had cost both of them before. But this time Hope lived in a place with wood smoke, bread rising by the stove, and a man who counted the distance to town not for escape, but so he could fetch more flour before they ran short. He began planning ahead in the same practical way he did everything. More wood stacked, another blanket bar fixed by the fire, a second shelf in the back room. Mrs. Penrose, upon hearing the news, sent over dried apples and said only, "Babies are hungry work. Eat," which from her was near tenderness. Spring came grudgingly. Mud took the yard first, then the first green near the creek, then the soft return of birds in the cottonwoods. Jonah learned to run badly, arms wide, legs determined and untrustworthy. Willa's belly rounded. Silas kept one eye on the fields and one on her, though he tried not to make a nuisance of himself about it. In May, before dawn on a morning washed gray with low clouds, her labor began. It was long, hard. Not like with Jonah, she said through clenched teeth, though she offered no more explanation and he did not ask. He heated water, changed cloths, steadied her when she paced, let her crush his hand in hers when the pains climbed high enough to break speech apart. By sunrise the child came squalling into the world, red-faced and furious at the cold. A girl. Willa took one look at her and began to cry, not with fear, not with relief alone, but with the overwhelming force of something once broken coming back whole in another shape. "Me," she whispered. "Her name is Me." Silas sat on the edge of the bed with tears standing openly in his own eyes and touched one finger to the baby's tiny fist. "Me Creed," he said, trying the sound like a blessing. Jonah met his sister that afternoon with grave suspicion, then approval once he learned she could not yet steal his spoon. The cabin grew fuller after that. Louder too. A baby's hungry cry before dawn, Jonah's running feet, Willa humming low under her breath while she sewed with Me at her breast, Silas coming in from the field with mud to his knees and a look on his face that said weariness had become a price he gladly paid. Summer opened the valley wide again, green at the creek bed, gold already gathering in the higher grass. Neighbors stopped more often now, not to pry, to trade eggs, cloth, news, and company. There was laughter at the table some evenings. Real laughter, with shoulders shaking and tears at the corners of eyes. Once after supper, Willa sat on the porch with Me sleeping against her and Jonah leaning on Silas's boot, and she watched the sky turn rose over the far hills. "Do you know what I keep thinking?" she asked. Silas looked at her. "What's that?" She smiled, slow and deep and certain. "I wasn't waiting for Darren on that roof. Not really. I was waiting for my life to begin, and I just had the wrong name for it." The first frost came again as it always did. The garden fell back. The hens grew meaner. Smoke began to hang low in the mornings. One evening Silas closed the shutters against the cold and turned to find Willa standing in the middle of the room with Me in her arms and Jonah pressed against her skirts. Firelight moved over all three of them. The sight stopped him the way some views stop a man on a ridge, making him forget for a second what he had been going to do. Willa smiled at him as if she knew exactly what had happened inside him. What, she asked. Silas crossed the room, touched Jonah's hair, then Me's cheek, then Willa's face. "Nothing," he said. "Only this is the part I never knew to ask for." She leaned into his hand. Outside the wind moved over the land, cold and old and endless. Inside the cabin held fast. Once it had been a place where a man slept alone and measured quiet by the creak of the stove. Now it held a woman who no longer watched the road, a boy who had learned that arms would always come when he cried, a baby girl born into safety, and a husband who had arrived late enough to understand the value of staying. Long after dark, with the children asleep and the fire burning low, Willa curled against Silas beneath the blankets and listened to his heartbeat under her cheek. There was no need to say what both of them already knew. The waiting was over. Home had come and meant to remain.